Welcome to the University Credit Union Center. Please take a moment to locate the exit nearest to you. In the unlikely event of a fire alarm or other emergency, please leave through that exit. Out of courtesy to the graduates, please silence all cellular devices, and please note that there are designated photo areas located in the east and west press boxes. We kindly ask for all participants and guests to stay for the entirety of the ceremony. Thank you for coming and enjoy the ceremony.
Welcome to the 79th Annual Graduate Studies Commencement MFA and Doctoral Ceremony at the University of California, Davis. At this time, please be seated to watch the following video. Thank you.
You're so close.
You're so close.
You're so close. Can you feel it?
Can you feel it?
Do you believe it? That moment you have been waiting for.
Working for? Once as undergraduates.
You strive to gain a broad education, perhaps savoring your newfound freedom and a taste of the college life.
But then, perhaps years later, you rededicated yourself.
In pursuit of a specialized expertise.
A whole life built around a single question.
At UC Davis, graduate students have always been the bedrock of our success.
You perform so many critical and integral functions.
As scholars,
Researchers, teachers.
Community builders.
You provide crucial assistance to both students and faculty and constitute an incredible community of diverse minds.
Completing a graduate degree
is
is
a formidable achievement in advanced scholarship.
In spite of all the hurdles and hardships, you saw it through.
You no doubt received support along the way from family, friends,
advisors, and
mentors.
mentors. But ultimately, this accomplishment is yours alone.
This education, this degree, will likely open doors for you. It will create career opportunities.
But it also positions you to improve the lives of others.
To provide leadership and advocacy in a time when it is desperately needed.
But today, these future concerns can wait. Today, it's time to celebrate.
Go forth, grow forth, wherever life takes you.
Or wherever you take life.
May you find yourself always outgrowing expectations.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 2025 Master of Fine Arts and Doctoral Commencement Convocation for Graduate Studies at the University of California, Davis is convened. Will Valerie Navarrete please come forward to sing the national anthem? Will the audience please rise if you are able and remain standing for the singing of the national anthem?
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Will the audience please be seated? And now, I would like to ask that you pause and reflect as we acknowledge the land.
We should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered.
For thousands of years, this land has been the home of Patwin people.
Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes.
Cachel-Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community,
Quetzal-Dihi Wintun Nation,
and the Yocha-Dihi Wintun Nation.
The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries.
It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations.
We're honored and grateful to be here today
on their traditional lands.
Before we begin our ceremony, we are sharing common rules of conduct so everyone can fully enjoy the program today. Our graduate students have worked hard to get to this special moment. Family and friends have supported them throughout and have traveled from near and far to celebrate this milestone. We owe our graduating students the best day possible. It is with this in mind that we request that you please silence your cell phones, stay in your seats, and keep the aisles clear. Actions that prevent our speakers from being heard, block the cameras or view of the speakers or stage, or prevent students from crossing the stage are not permitted. Let's celebrate this moment in the spirit of mutual respect and caring that guides us at UC Davis. Thank you for your respect and assistance in keeping the event focused on celebrating every graduate's accomplishment today. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present Jean-Pierre Delplanque, Vice Provost and Dean of Graduate Studies and Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering.
Graduates, friends, and family members, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Graduate Studies Commencement ceremony. Today, we celebrate the achievements of our 2025 MFA and Doctoral degree recipients. Graduates, it is my honor to stand before you and say congratulations. I know the long hours, late nights, and intense research and study that have gone into earning this degree, and I can only imagine the pride that you feel having reached that final ceremonial moment. Even if a small voice in your head was also saying, I'm just glad it's over now. Graduate education can be a very solitary pursuit. You spend much of your time focusing on work that can feel deeply personal and consuming. Yet today, as I look around this room, I see the collective power of our graduate education community. Each of you has shaped the intellectual and scholarly depth of our university. You have forged new discoveries, advanced our classrooms, and served as mentors and colleagues to your peers and to our undergraduates. Together, we've made this university stronger, and I believe that celebrating the impact of your work has never been more important or more timely. In fact, next academic year, Graduate Studies will commemorate a huge milestone, 100 years of graduate education in Davis. In the fall of 1925, the university's first 12 graduate students came to Davis to study agriculture. Over the last century, those dozen graduate students working in a single discipline transformed into a community of more than 7,000 graduate students working across the arts, humanities, and STEM fields. It's a remarkable story of growth, discovery, innovation, and leadership. And it's a story that all of you have helped write and will continue to help write as you take your next step. I would like to take a moment to thank the friends, family members, and loved ones who have supported you, as well as those who remain with you in spirit. And I want to give a special recognition to all of the children of our graduating student parents. Graduate student parents display a remarkable level of commitment and resiliency that we want to acknowledge. Would any children of our graduates here today please stand to help us honor your parent? Finally, I extend my gratitude to the faculty, staff, mentors, and colleagues who have guided you. Their support has been essential to your academic and professional growth. Of course, the benefit of a graduate education extends far beyond campus, and we look forward to welcoming you to the Graduate Alumni Network, where you can connect with new and exciting opportunities. Thank you for choosing UC Davis as your home for your graduate education journey. Remember that no matter where you go and whatever new heights you reach, UC Davis will always be home for you. Thank you. The Graduate Council, charged by the Academic Senate with ensuring excellence in all graduate academic programs, oversees this ceremony. I am joined on stage by members of the UC Davis leadership, whose names are displayed above. I ask the entire stage party to stand and be recognized. Thank you for taking part in today's ceremony. Please be seated. I now invite all faculty present to please rise. I am pleased to present the faculty members participating in today's commencement. We thank you for your many contributions to graduate education. Your devotion to teaching and mentoring enables our graduate students to succeed. The faculty, please be seated. Now, I would like to introduce Chancellor Gary May. Chancellor May is a highly engaged leader with a passion for helping others succeed. He believes success is best judged by how we enhance the lives of others. Throughout his career, he has championed diversity, equity, and inclusion in both higher education and the workplace. He developed nationally recognized programs that attract, mentor, and retain underrepresented groups in the STEM fields of science, technology, engineering, and math. In 2015, President Obama honored him with the Presidential Award for Excellence in STEM Mentoring. Chancellor May earned his master's and PhD degrees in electrical engineering and computer science at UC Berkeley. He was inducted into the National Academy of Engineering in 2018 and elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2020 under the classification of educational and academic leadership. In 2021, he received the Lifetime Mentor Award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science and an honorary doctorate from the Georgia Institute of Technology. A prominent voice in higher education, May is a commissioner of the Council on Competitiveness and serves on various national committees. His vision as UC Davis' 7th Chancellor is to lead the university to new heights in academic excellence, inclusion, public service, and upward mobility for students from all backgrounds. Please welcome Chancellor Gary May.
Thank you, JP. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome the distinguished members of our stage party, along with the faculty, staff, and families and friends here with us today. Most importantly, though, let's give a big round of applause to the class of 2025. Graduating students, this is your moment. After all the long hours of studying, hours of being head down in the labs, nights and weekends spent grading papers, you did it. And not only did you reach a goal you've dreamed of for years, you did it at one of the top universities in the nation. Yeah. Now with your degrees from UC Davis, we are all thrilled for where you will go next. We are thrilled for who you will become and for the mark you will make on the world. On a day like today, I can't help but feel joyful and optimistic. As we look out in the sea of caps and gowns, you give us faith that a better tomorrow is indeed possible. You are the inventors and researchers and scientists and artists and leaders and visionaries of tomorrow. The world needs you now more than ever. I see the people who will heal our planet, bridge the divides that separate us, and build a more just and equitable future for everyone. I've seen your empathy in times of struggle, your determination in moments of challenge, and your compassion in hours of injustice. Each of you came to UC Davis with a unique story. Your diverse experiences, backgrounds, and values shaped you. Your cultures, traditions, and communities instilled a sense of purpose and inclusion. You came from across California, the country, and around the world. You came from rural towns and the world's largest cities. But no matter your background, you made UC Davis shine with your brilliance and your tenacity. So as you move to this next chapter, I want to share a motto that served me well. That is, try every day to learn something, to help someone, and to make the world a better place. All of you are prepared to do just that. After all, you are the scientists and engineers who will develop the technologies to feed a rapidly growing planet and address climate change as the world's population continues to grow. You are the next generation of mathematicians and statisticians whose problem-solving skills will help us better understand the world and make it a better place. You are the teachers and educators who will pass along knowledge and bring hope to generations of students. You are the writers, actors, and dancers whose self-expression will bring truth and beauty to the world. You will shape a better tomorrow. You came to UC Davis to unlock your potential, and that is just what you've done. Now is the time to reflect on all you've learned and all those you've taught. The world needs your immense talent, your diverse ideas, and your boundless empathy. Finally, remember that the graduate school experience is defined as much by what is learned beyond the textbook and the classroom as by academics. I'm reminded of a quote from one of my personal heroes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1947, he said words that ring true today. We must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the true goal of education. So keep your Aggie heart with you always. Keep learning. Keep striving to help others. Keep working to make this world a better place. Whatever path you're pursuing now and whatever your goals for the future, knock it out of the park. Make it great. Congratulations, graduate class of 2025. Go Ags!
Thank you, Chancellor May. I would now like to invite Sandeep Dugar, our president and founder of the Graduate Alumni Network, to say a few words. Sandeep is an international scientific and business expert with decades of experience founding and growing drug discovery and development companies. His drug discovery and development experience spans most therapeutic areas, including oncology and infectious diseases, at both major pharmaceutical companies and biotech. Sandeep earned his doctoral degree at UC Davis in 1984 in chemistry. Please help me welcome him.
Good afternoon. You all can say, phew. We're here finally. I still remember 4 decades ago when I was in those seats. It's still a fresh memory. So congratulations to you, to your family, and to your friends, because today marks an incredible milestone in your academic journey. Your curiosity, dedication, and perseverance have led you to this achievement. But you also have to move on, and same strength that has brought you here will take you forward. And as you step into the next chapter, stay connected. Look at the people around you. They have come from different parts of the globe, and they will go to separate parts of the world. Stay connected, because the experience and relationships you've built here at UC Davis should continue and expand. The network you build will be a testimonial to your success. And you will create it in coming years. We'll stand by you as you traverse through your professional and personal journey. That's why the UC Davis Graduate Alumni Network is for you. It was founded to foster a vibrant, supportive, and lasting community for UC Davis graduate alumni and postdoctoral scholars. It's free to join. There's a QR code you can find on the Graduate Studies website, and it's easy to do. And it can help you stay connected with each other, as well as connect you with the extensive alumni network out there. The benefits are palpable and too many to enumerate here. As president and one of the founders of the Graduate Alumni Network, this is my personal invitation to you. Particularly when times are uncertain, and we know of them, we'll have each other. Since I graduated, this is one aspect I missed the most. Hence, I took it upon myself to try and address it. But this will not be a success unless you are all also involved in it. This is our network for the graduate alumni, by the graduate alumni. So join, participate, converse, connect, opine, and lead. Let us build something lasting and impactful for ourselves, our network, our community, and the world. Once again, congratulations to you, your friends and families. We are very proud of what you have achieved, and we will continue to cheer you on. And I can't wait to welcome you into the UC Davis Graduate Alumni family. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Before we proceed, I would like to ask anyone to please remain until the end of the ceremony out of respect for the accomplishments of the remaining graduates. Thank you in advance for your cooperation and for ensuring every graduate receives their well-deserved moment of public recognition.
Certificates for completion of graduate curricula and the degrees conferred by the University of California attest to the scholastic achievement of the recipients. On behalf of the Academic Senate, I am pleased to recommend awarding of the degrees of Master of Fine Arts, Doctor of Education, and Doctor of Philosophy to those who have completed the degree requirements.
Will only the candidates for the degree Master of Fine Arts please rise and remain standing while the degree is conferred. The recipients of the Master of Fine Arts degree have successfully completed the equivalent of at least 3/4 of study and creative work in their respective disciplines. They are prepared for positions of responsibility in performance and teaching in their particular fields of study. Chancellor May, I present the candidates for the degree Master of Fine Arts.
By virtue of the authority vested in me by the Regents of the University of California, I confer upon you the degree Master of Fine Arts.
Will the candidates please remain standing? Will the major professors of the recipients of the degree Masters of Fine Arts please bring their students forward as instructed by the ushers? Master of Fine Arts graduates are generally arranged on the floor alphabetically by the last name of their faculty presenter.
Brenton William Haslam, FMA in Art, presented by Professor Shiva Ahmadi. Joel Taylor Mernon, MFA in Art, presented by Professor Shiva Ahmadi. Raquel Marie Tripp, MFA in Art, presented by Professor Shiva Ahmadi. Luc Daclay, MFA in Creative Writing, presented by Professor Lucy Corin. Marilyn Isabel Ramirez, MFA in Creative Writing, presented by Professor Lucy Corin. Damika Marie Thomas, MFA in Creative Writing, presented by Professor Lucy Corin. Stephen Wayne Valenzuela, MFA in Creative Writing, presented by Professor Lucy Corin. Kai Francis Wilson, MFA in Creative Writing, presented by Professor Lucy Corin. Isadora Marie Goldschneider, MFA in Design, presented by Professor Simon Sadler. Desi Chungji Jin, MFA in Design, presented by Professor Simon Sadler. Zarina Majidova, MFA in Design, presented by Professor Simon Sadler. Diego Martinez Fernandez del Castillo, MFA in Design, presented by Professor Simon Sadler. Magda Lucida Rojas Valdez, MFA in Design, presented by Professor Simon Sadler.
Will only the candidates for the degree Doctor of Education and Doctor of Philosophy please rise and remain standing while the degrees are conferred? The doctoral degrees are awarded to those who have successfully completed a rigorous course of study and have made original contributions to their particular fields of knowledge. The recipients of those degrees are prepared to assume positions of leadership in academia and society. Chancellor May, I present the candidates for the doctoral degrees.
By virtue of the authority vested in me by the Regents of the University of California, I confer upon you the doctoral degree.
Will the candidates please be seated? Will the major professors of the recipients of the degree Doctor of Education and Doctor of Philosophy please bring their student forward as instructed by the ushers? Doctoral graduates are generally arranged on the floor alphabetically by their last name of the faculty member presenter. This arrangement allows all of our graduates to be presented and walk the stage with their chosen faculty member.
Timea Below, PhD in Political Science, presented by Professor James Adams. Yixuan Huang, PhD in Political Science, presented by Professor James Adams. Sylvia Noble Abunasen, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Alba Alfonso Garcia. Efibe Odette Ohulu, PhD in Chemistry and Chemical Biology, presented by Professor James Ames. Dilipsai Kumar Pulur, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Shota Otsumi. Nicole S. Rodriguez, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Jeffrey Attardo. Javier Atzitararian, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Matthew Augustin. Abdullah Ahmed Refai, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Ramzi Badawi. Sarah Costa, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Alan Balch. Jace K. Kuski, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Karen Bales. Tamara Cristiani, PhD in Integrative Genetics and Genomics, presented by Professors Javier Asuaga and Mariel Vasquez. Tim Andreas Linka, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Jean-Pierre Delplanque. Rachel M. Del Porto, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Christopher Kappa. Sydney Yvonne Wood, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Jeffrey Shank. Nathaniel Herrera, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Physiology, presented by Professor Eleonora Grandi. Gabriela Cristina del Toro Rivera, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Physiology, presented by Professor Eleonora Grandi. Yu Huang, PhD in Agriculture and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Daniela Barile. Andrea Natsumi Odell, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Mariska Basket. Leslie Ann Guerrero, PhD in Integrative Genetics and Genomics, presented by Professor Rachel Bay. Adam Taylor Nissen, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Emery Beck. Kaylina D. Lombardo, PhD in Integrative Genetics and Genomics, presented by Professor David Begun. Mel Johnson, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Heather Vishel. Chang J. Lee, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Mary Ann Page. Se Jung Oh, PhD in Economics, presented by Professors Mary Ann Bittler and Mary Ann Page. Kepler Illich, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Mary Ann Bittler. Kevin Din, PhD in Economics, presented by Professors Mary Ann Bittler and Michelle Coe. Bobby Chokoloff, PhD in Public Health Sciences, presented by Professor Michelle Coe. Biniam Tesfaya Banja, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Kenneth Brown. Bridget Fibian Smith, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Susan Brown. Yvonne Olaya, PhD in Integrative Genetics and Genomics, presented by Professor Sean Burgess. Jasmine Green, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Mary Cadanaso. Seyayom Ru, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Manuel Calderon de la Barca Sanchez. Colin James Wanacott, PhD in History, presented by Professor Ian Campbell. Wei-Xuan Hu, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Stephen Carlip. Rylan Kenneth Victory Devert, PhD in Geology, presented by Professor Sandra Carlson. Greg DePaul, PhD in Applied Mathematics, presented by Professor Eric Carlson. Shui Feng, PhD in Applied Mathematics, presented by Professor Eric Carlson. Avishai Halev, PhD in Applied Mathematics, presented by Professor Eric Carlson. Gavin Pandya, PhD in Mathematics, presented by Professor Eric Carlson. Brian Batung Nguyen, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professors Randy Carney and Stephen George. Victor Chu, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Randy Carney. Neona Lo, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Randy Carney. Hannah Julia O'Toole, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Randy Carney. Tyler Shaw Hoppenfeld, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Andres Carvajal. Justin Thomas Koo, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Andres Carvajal. Tina Danting Jiang, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Andres Carvajal. Estelle Heon Shin, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Scott Carroll. Cassandra Merritt, PhD in Economics, presented by Professors Giovanni Perry and Scott Carroll. Dennis Osinski, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Giovanni Perry. Zachary William Swager, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Daniel Sibra. Megan Helene Gash, PhD in Geography, presented by Professor Michael Carter. Saida Warada Riaz, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Michael Carter. Alida Desal de Almeida, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Abhijat Chowdhury. Valerie Alexandria Porter, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Abhijit Chowdhury. Jing Liu, PhD in Biostatistics, presented by Professor Hao Chun. Tianyan Hua, PhD in Comparative Literature, presented by Professor Xiao Mei Chun. Daphne Augustino Di Loretto, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Nipaven Chiam-Viomanat. Muhammad Imad Rasul, PhD in Communication, presented by Professor Jae-Ho Cho. Rebecca Lindsay Jones, PhD in Anthropology, presented by Professor Timothy Choi. Merna Sharifian, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Chen Yi Chua. Jane Shawcroft, PhD in Communication, presented by Professor Drew Single. Aaliyah Middleton, PhD in Sociology, presented by Professor Orly Clerget. Jay Yu, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor James Cloyne. Yongyeon Oh, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor James Cloyne. Tianrun Li, PhD in Plant Pathology, presented by Professor Gitta Croker. Alma E. Poseras Koba, PhD in Integrative Genetics and Genomics, presented by Professor Luca Comai. Jeffrey Groh, PhD in Population Biology, presented by Professor Graham Coop. Jiacheng Xu, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Daniel Cox. Amanda Caceres, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Kyle Crabtree. Hanyue Wang, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Kyle Crabtree. Robert Lee Woodkey, PhD in Geography, presented by Professor Amanda Crump. Furbati Sherpa, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Nicholas Kuro. Joseph Austin Williams, PhD in Microbiology, presented by Professor Scott Dawson. Onur Arslan, PhD in Anthropology, presented by Professor Marisol de la Cadena. Felix Almendra Hernandez, PhD in Mathematics, presented by Professor Jesus de Loera. Tony Scroggin, PhD in Mathematics, presented by Professor Jesus de Loera. Joshua Peter Turner, PhD in Mathematics, presented by Professor Jesus de Loera. Lily Rose Salinas, PhD in Pharmacology and Toxicology, presented by Professor Elena Detkova. Jane Ong, PhD in Food Science, presented by Professor Julian Delarue. Stephanie Page McDonald, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Anna Denicol. Sadikshia Sharma, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Luis Diaz Garcia. Chun Wei He, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Elva Diaz. David Groh, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Prem Kumar Devanbu. Mani Ramanan, PhD in Food Science, presented by Professors Glenn Fox and Christine Diepenbrock. Rebecca Jacqueline Dumansky, PhD in Plant Biology, presented by Professor Christine Diepenbrock. Muhammad Naveed Anwar, PhD in Atmospheric Sciences, presented by Professor Ann Dillner. Bradley Scott Chu, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Christina Davis. Joshua Gabriel Greenspak Petrak, PhD in Applied Mathematics, presented by Professor David Doty. Marisano James James, PhD in Population Biology, presented by Professor Jonathan Eisen. Daniel Jeffrey Kozar, PhD in Hydrologic Sciences, presented by Professor Xiao Li Dong. Kyle Andrew Phillips, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor John Durand. Cristina Raquel Moraga Franco, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Raina Engel Stone. Lauren Ann Thompson, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Raina Engel Stone. Shi Chen Jung, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Melanie Dove. Margaret Lynn Behrens, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Davide Donadio. Cam Tung Chan, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Davide Donadio. Zhe Kung Chen, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Davide Donadio. Nicholas Wayne Lundgren, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Davide Donadio. Tatiana Mamani, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Davide Donadio. Nathaniel Troop, PhD in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Davide Donadio. Taro Valentin Brown, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Fadi Fathala. Quimby Nicole Lee, PhD in Neuroscience, presented by Professor Audrey Fan. Charlotte Kerber, PhD in Public Health Sciences, presented by Professor Laura Ferreman. Beverly Teresa Cotter, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Fernanda Ferreira. Rohit Batra, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Emilio Ferrer. Simram Kaur Johal, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professors Michael Remtula and Emilio Ferrer. Emily Sarah Sklar, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Debbie Fetter. Eamon Sebastian Cressman, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Fernando Fierro. Isaac Joseph Villegas, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Physiology, presented by Professor Kyle Fink. Stephanie Ryan, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Carrie Finno. Samantha Lee Van Buren, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Carrie Finno. Ashrita Manjunath, PhD in Chemistry and Chemical Biology, presented by Professor Andrew Fisher. Prince Salvador, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Andrew Fisher. Matthew David Corbelli, PhD in Mathematics, presented by Professor Martin Frost. Siddharth Wadnerkar, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Martin Frost. Adeline Bernal Sanchez, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Annalise France. Amy Rose Leslie, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Alan Gowell. Vigdis Asmundsson, PhD in Education, presented by Professor Kevin G. Eileen Forbes Hill, Education D in Education Leadership, presented by Professor Kevin G. Patrick Lawrence Montaigne, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Lorena Garcia. Christopher Haidt, PhD in Soils and Biogeochemistry, presented by Professor Daniel Geisler. Wei Tai Ching, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Sohail Ghiassi. Zunaira Komal Shakur, PhD in Anthropology, presented by Professor Cristiana Giordano. Yi Hung Huang, PhD in Neuroscience, presented by Professor Mark Goldman. James Benjamin Keeler, PhD in Agriculture and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Rachel Goodhue. Isabel E. Picciotto, PhD in Agriculture and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Rachel Goodhue. Samuel Rayburn, PhD in Agriculture and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Rachel Goodhue. Reina Nicole Enriquez, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Gail Goodman. Dana Trutner Hartman, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Gail Goodman. Andrea Ramirez Barajas, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Catherine Graf Estes. Cyrus Maxwell Espino, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Physiology, presented by Professor Theanne Griffin. Elizabeth A. Boylan, PhD in Sociology, presented by Professor Laura Grinstaff. Lixian Lim, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Jean Guillarguignot. Andrew Manhai Chun, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Mohammed Hafez. Angelita Repetto, PhD in Sociology, presented by Professor Aaron Hamilton. Ray Hosenzadeh, PhD in Transportation Technology and Policy, presented by Professor Susan Handy. Akansha Jain, PhD in Transportation Technology and Policy, presented by Professor Susan Handy. Aaron Angelo Benedetti, PhD in Cultural Studies, presented by Professor Christoph Hansman. Kelly Marie Hoagland, PhD in Transportation Technology and Policy, presented by Professor Scard Hardman. Emily Michelle Alonso, PhD in Education, presented by Professor Cassandra Hart. Chase Elliott Hawes, PhD in Immunology, presented by Professor Dennis Hartigan O'Connor. Sampat Kararasetti, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor John Harvey. Mohammed Ashikur Rahman, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor John Harvey. Shovik Roy, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professors John Harvey and Sumaya Nasiri. Mohammed Mustafa Haider, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Sumaya Nasiri. Alan Chi Hao Lu, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor John Henderson. Donna Raed Al-Hindi, PhD in Anthropology, presented by Professor Brenna Henn. William Leon Taylor, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Jonathan Herman. Emma Forrester, PhD in Geography, presented by Professor Rebecca Hernandez. Yudi Lee, PhD in Energy Systems, presented by Professor Rebecca Hernandez. Tamara Raquel Solazano, PhD in Public Health Sciences, presented by Irva Hertz Picciotto. Irina Chukrai, PhD in Sociology, presented by Professor Jacob Hibble. Chase James Boyer, PhD in Human Development, presented by Professor Leah Hibble. Felipe Grimaldi Aviles, PhD in Agriculture and Resource Economics, presented by Professors Jens Hilscher and Bulat Garafov. Trong Xiao Fang, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Halman Humayun. Sayeda Elahe Hossein Imeni, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Halman Humayun. Hossein Mohammadi Makrani, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Halman Humayun. Najme Nazari Bavarsad, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Human Homanu. Ryan Sang, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Homan Hamayun. Feriska Eddie Putri, PhD in Biological Systems and Engineering, presented by Professor Tien Chie Hung. Sun Kyun Lee, PhD in Integrative Genetics and Genomics, presented by Professor Neil Hunter. Suyakon Achasapawat, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Chang Il Huang. Ahasan Ahmed, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Saif Islam. Sarah Dennis Bauer, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Alan Jen. Trisha Varshini Ramadas, PhD in Transportation Technology and Policy, presented by Professor Alan Jen. Hanif Tayarani, PhD in Transportation Technology and Policy, presented by Professor Alan Jen. Joseph Arbayo, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Peng Zhu. Shaya Erica Navashes, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Peng Zhu. Lin Mai Fan, PhD in Political Sciences, presented by Professor Bradford Jones. Hannah Elizabeth Morris Little, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Selena Juliano. Steve K. Trexler, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Mary Cable. Catherine Seeger-Locke, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Daniel Karp. Luis Jose Garay, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Susan Kozlarich. Aditya Rajkamal Junjunwala, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Amit Kanvinde. Arka Maiti, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Amit Kanvinde. Eleanor May Pressman, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Ermias Kabrab. Jingjing Xie, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Teresa Keegan. Pablo Bush, PhD in Energy Systems, presented by Professor Alyssa Kendall. Francisco Alejandro Pares Olguin, PhD in Energy Systems, presented by Professor Alyssa Kendall. Runhua Ivan Scholl, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Alyssa Kendall. Hong Yang, PhD in Energy Systems, presented by Professor Alyssa Kendall. Wen Yi Sui, PhD in Soils and Biogeochemistry, presented by Professor Isaya Kiseka. Karthik Prabhu Palimar, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Lloyd Knox. Dylan Paul Forrester, PhD in Political Science, presented by Professor Daniel Kono. Ryu Gyung Park, PhD in Political Science, presented by Professor Daniel Kono. Ashley Marie Flores, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Brian Leonard. Erin Alyssa Hizzy, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Brian Leonard. Maria Conwall, PhD in Energy Systems, presented by Professor Kurt Kernbloff. Adam Christopher Davis, PhD in German, presented by Professor Elizabeth Krimmer. Kunlin Wu, PhD in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Ambarish Kulkarni. Elizabeth M. Sear, PhD in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Ambarish Kulkarni. Xin Yin Yi, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Li Fang Lai. Rui Chung Huang, PhD in Chemistry and Chemical Biology, presented by Professor Kit Lam. Sakshi Pandita, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Kit Lam. Shuishan Li, PhD in Statistics, presented by Professor Kan Lei. Jonathan Aginyaga, PhD in Population Biology, presented by Professor Kate Laskowski. Michael Russell Silas Alvarez, PhD in Chemistry and Chemical Biology, presented by Carlito Labria. Sean Ellers Chiang, PhD in Chemistry and Chemical Biology, presented by Professor Carlito Labria. Xavier Alexander Holmes, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Carlito Labria. Sofia Jiong, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Carlito Labria. Christopher Suarez, PhD in Chemistry and Chemical Biology, presented by Professor Carlito Labria. Alina da Silva Frost, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Allison Ledgerwood. Jessie Renee Badley, PhD in Pharmacology and Toxicology, presented by Professor Pamela Fideline. Mei Yun Chung, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Physiology, presented by Professor Pamela Lane. Jasmine S. Yang, PhD in Food Science, presented by Professor Juliana Leite Nobrega de Morabel. Jillian Bergman, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Johan Lefol. Hilary Kikumi Gianna Kao, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Biology, presented by Deborah Liu. Jackson Blake Fogelquist, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Sin Fan Lin. Ray Huang, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Xin-Fan Ling. Felicia Folashade Fushanu, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Barbara Linka. Xianling Zhang, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Bruce Lindquist. Calvin Huaoyang Huang, PhD in Plant Biology, presented by Professor Bo Liu. Robert Hernandez, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Yang Hong Liu. Yu Yang Lin, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Gabriela Lutz. Sarah Vanessa Mendoza, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Physiology, presented by Professor Gabriela Lutz. Sophie Orr, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Gabriela Lutz. Andres David Morales Maldonado, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Gang Yi Liu. Lauren Elizabeth Oman, PhD in Chemistry and Chemical Biology, presented by Professor Angelique Louis. Kira Sky Moser Daskalaskis, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Mark Lubell. Tara Brooke Posey, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Mark Lubell. David E. Ayers, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Robert Lusardi. Jiting Jiang, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Travis Libert. Sirenio Hisasaga, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Maya Makagon-Stewart. Sukin Das, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Ron Mangan. David Bauer, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Kwan Yo Ma. Jasmine Machuca, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Gerardo Mackenzie. Joanna Virkus, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Gerardo Mackenzie. Menglin Yo, PhD in Political Science, presented by Professor Scott Mackenzie. Vanessa Madrigal-Lockland, PhD in History, presented by Professor Lisa Matterson. Brooke Nicole Genovese, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professors Jonah Mazet and Brian Bird. Katie Kennedy Coleman, PhD in Plant Pathology, presented by Professor Neil McRoberts. Catherine Ruth Haddad, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Karen McDonald. Justin Hoyin Wong, PhD in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Karen McDonald. Alma Araceli Peraza Aquino, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Francis McNally. Weng-Ji Li, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Francis McNally. Elena Nguyen, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Stephen McSorley. Dasha Akyakina, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Pierre Merrill. Maria Ferrer Ruiz, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Richard Mitchellmore. Allison McKinley Weir, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Richard Mitchellmore. Marilyn Florero, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Diana Migloretti. Sarah Lynn Payne Kavar, PhD in Cultural Studies, presented by Professor Colin Milburn. Allison Blair Moss, PhD in English, presented by Professor Elizabeth Miller. Talitha Angelica Akyler Trazo, PhD in Cultural Studies, presented by Professor Suzette Min. Saram Vinay Vijaya Raghavan, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Prasant Mohapatra. Aditya Krishnan, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Prasant Mohapatra. Raja Jabi Ullah Khan, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Carla Moody. Krista Allison Tongpla, PhD in Pharmacology and Toxicology, presented by Professors Lisa Miller and Kent Pinkerton. Xiaohan Li, PhD in Pharmacology and Toxicology, presented by Professor Kent Pinkerton. Skylar Jove Reese, PhD in Linguistics, presented by Professor Emily Morgan. Daniela Patricia Quiroz, PhD in Integrative Genetics and Genomics, presented by Professor John Monroe. Sandeep Regmi, PhD in Political Science, presented by Professor Gabriela Montinola. Socorro Pardo Martinez, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Diane Morera. Tristan J. Deppie, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Jeremy Monday. Michael Kakit Sheng, PhD in Immunology, presented by Professor William Murphy. Logan Vahid Vick, PhD in Integrative Biology, presented by Professor William Murphy. Ethan Field, PhD in Material Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Adam Moulay. Teresa Faith Wexler, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Ben Monpetit. Soila Maribel Estrada Tobar, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Manuel Navedo Morales. Brandon Sells, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Physiology, presented by Professor Manuel Navedo Morales. Manuel Rendero Hito, PhD in History, presented by Professor Bettina Ngueno. Dante Iverson Barksdale, PhD in History, presented by Professors Charles Walker and Bettina Ngueno. It Song Cheng, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Randall O'Reilly. Christian Marie Nelson, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Lisa Oakes. Nathan Alexander Kinsey, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Anita Oberbauer. Sarah Winsemius, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Alessandra Osola. Anna Chensitz Kundman, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Frank Osterlaw. Christopher Field Carnahan, PhD in Biophysics, presented by Professor Atul Parikh. Maria Jose Gutierrez Jimenez, PhD in Spanish, presented by Professor Ana Palufo. Jeremias Peralta Gutierrez, PhD in Spanish, presented by Professor Ana Palufo. Ana Leticia de Leon Hernandez, PhD in Spanish, presented by Professors Ana Palufo and Emily Vasquez Enriquez. Tyler Foy Kelly, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Anvu Pham. Qifeng Ye, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Alda Pires. Tao Tao Liu, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Alda Pires. Hongru Hu, PhD in Integrative Genetics and Genomics, presented by Professor Gerald Kwan. Suraj Abbasi Kupayagani, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Hamid Pirsiavash. Navneet Kudar Lakshmirani Murthy, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Hamid Pirsiavash. Momtano Chakraborty, PhD in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Alireza Pureza. Sirapum Penyu Hazah, PhD in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Alireza Pureza. Jason Wu Liu, PhD in Population Biology, presented by Professor Santiago Ramirez. Sheng Jie Zhu, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor John Ramsey. Dennis Karanfil, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Baram Ravani. Frederick Theodore Strabo, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Matthew Reimer. Ellen Casey Anderson, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Amrin Rizai. Kalyani Chowdhury, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Armin Rizai. Eric Yiru Lee, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Crystal Ripplinger. Felipe Esteban Saez Cortez, PhD in Plant Pathology, presented by Professor David Rizzo. Tamer Hisham Barkouki, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Stephen Robinson. Adan Garcia, PhD in Cultural Studies, presented by Professor Robin Rodriguez. Wayne Edward Chapanda, PhD in Cultural Studies, presented by Professor Robin Rodriguez. Patrick Chapman, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Cindy Rubio Gonzalez. Jackson Dean Vanover, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Cindy Rubio Gonzalez. Kang Tone, PhD in Philosophy, presented by Professor Tina Rulli. Sean Kim, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Catherine Russ. Carla Arispe Soto Sausa, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Physiology, presented by Professor Karen Ryan. Ji Ting Wu, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Physiology, presented by Professor Karen Ryan. Rebecca Ann Nelson, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Stephen Sadro. Pavel Morales, PhD in Integrative Pathology, presented by Professor Jeroen Sai. Felipe Rodriguez, PhD in Immunology, presented by Professor Jeroen Saij. Peter Jangmin Chi, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Nestor Sarillon Klein. David Tu, PhD in Mathematics, presented by Professor Jennifer Schultens. Hyun Soo Kim, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Richard Scalater. Yu Tan Zhang, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Richard Scalater. Zoe Baesdorfer Kaplan, PhD in Public Health Sciences, presented by Professor Rebecca Schmidt. Peter Johnson, PhD in Integrative Genetics and Genomics, presented by Professor Andrea Schreier. Zhu Jiang, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Richard Sexton. Sofia Marie Manillo, PhD in Linguistics, presented by Professor Claudio Sanchez Gutierrez. Mary Ann Louise Riley, PhD in Microbiology, presented by Professor Justin Siegel. Alexander Keel, PhD in Biophysics, presented by Professors Justin Siegel and Patrick Shi. Saadi Mohammed Shariar, PhD in Material Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Erkin Secker. Hae Hyun Kim, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Erkin Secker. Natalie Hamada, PhD in Plant Biology, presented by Professor Nitsan Shabek. Matthew William Dyer, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Jared Shaw. Chung En Xie, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Jared Shaw. Garrett Toth Williams, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Jared Shaw. Si Jia Qian, PhD in Communication, presented by Professor Seo Ha Chin. Mira Korb, PhD in Agriculture and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Ashish Shenoy. Lin Qingjong, PhD in Plant Pathology, presented by Professor Sadiq Siddiq. Kiri Alexandra Forster, PhD in French and Francophone Studies, presented by Professor Julia Simon. Pedro Liedo Orozco, PhD in Agriculture and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Aaron Smith. Juliana L. Madigan, PhD in Immunology, presented by Professor Ryan Snodgrass. Saleh Salman, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Fabio Suarez de Lima. Shannon Marie Clayton, PhD in Chemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Athena Solika. Joanna Vega Garcia, PhD in Education, presented by Professor Nicole Sparapani. Charlotte Hanson Terry, PhD in History, presented by Professor Rachel St. John. Celine Gumus Dereglioglu, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Daniel Starr. Jonathan Estuardo Fajardo, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Christine Stewart. Caroline Abbott Joyce, PhD in Public Health Sciences, presented by Professor Christine Stewart. Elise Christine Reynolds, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Christine Stewart. Kayla Marcello, PhD in Microbiology, presented by Professor Dawn Summer. Hui Ren, PhD in Plant Biology, presented by Professor Venkatasan Sundarasan. Elena Shiva Jahanfard, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Tamara Swab. Catherine Sendek, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Tamara Swab. Will DeSnow, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Dean Tatillo. Wang Yuk Kong, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Dean Tantillo. Marie Charlotte Klein, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Gail Taylor. Yu Fei Chan, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Gail Taylor. Andrea Michelle Guggenbichler, PhD in Public Health Sciences, presented by Professor Laura Lynn Taylor. Benjamin Makoto Godkin, PhD in Applied Mathematics, presented by Professor Joseph Tehran. Jiu Tao, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Aditya Thakur. Yi Han Jin, PhD in Neuroscience, presented by Professor Lin Tian. Kiran Ramchandran Long Iyer, PhD in Neuroscience, presented by Professor Lin Tian. Nikki Chayono, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Lin Tian. Sydney Woodruff, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Brian Todd. Amanda Joyce Frazier, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Ann Todgham. Hollis R. Jones, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Ann Todgham. Frederick Allen Nelson, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Ann Todgham. Daniela Jimenez, PhD in Immunology, presented by Professor Christine Todebush. Madison Elizabeth Luker, PhD in Immunology, presented by Professor Christine Todebush. Lisbeth Camacho, PhD in Microbiology, presented by Professor Renee Solis. Alicia Marie Duranke, PhD in Animal Behavior, presented by Professor Cassandra Tucker. Isabel Marie McDonald Gilmartin, PhD in Animal Behavior, presented by Professor Cassandra Tucker. Joseph Michael Levine, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor J. Anthony Tyson. William David Douglas Hahn, PhD in Material Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Klaus von Bentham. Emily Marie Phillips, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Dirk van Vuren. Rowan S. Brower, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Jesus Velasquez. Esteli Yamelet Carranza, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Jesus Velasquez. Rose Elizabeth Smiley, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Jesus Velasquez. Manasvin Rajagopalan, PhD in Comparative Literature, presented by Professor Archana Venkatasan. Suthir Anand Sridhar, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Ina Vishik. Grace Zheng, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Igor Vorobyov. Kyle Christopher Rowan, PhD in Biophysics, presented by Professor Igor Vorobyov. Subhobrata Chatterjee, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Andrew Waldron. Thomas Andrew Jackson, PhD in Mathematics, presented by Professor Andrew Waldron. Austin Peak Lurie, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Spencer Walsh. Brianna Tafoya Riviere, PhD in History, presented by Professor Lewis Warren. Ophir Cahalan, PhD in English, presented by Professor Tiffany Worth. Courtney Cahalan, PhD in English, presented by Professor Tiffany Worth. Kirsten Schumacher, PhD in English, presented by Professor Tiffany Worth. Tony Lou Duarte, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Xiang Yang. Matthew Robert Benson, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Wei Jian Yang. Feng Qian, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Wei Jian Yang. Lu Chi Huang, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Wei Jian Yang. Humphrey Chen, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Sungju Yu. Brittany Nicole Salibi, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Thomas Young. Bob Minyu Wang, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Dong Yu. Jing Chao Fang, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Hao Chuan Wang. Jia Wei Liang, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Hao Chuan Wang. Qin Xiaoyang Zhu, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Hao Chuan Wang. Ashley Rose Keaton, PhD in Linguistics, presented by Professor Giorgio Zilou. Jules S. Vonneson, PhD in Linguistics, presented by Professor Giorgio Zilou. Nicholas Michael Petrie, PhD in German, presented by Professor Zhongji Zhang. Christopher Richard Niedek, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Qi Zhang. Emily Forsyth Steliotis, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Qi Zhang. Brian Lee, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Ming Jiao. Zachary Crawford, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Gergely Zimani. Catherine Cheng, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Katerina Ziatopoulou. Tommy Louis Dudash Fenster, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Amélie Gaudin. Mariana Munoz Oraya, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Amélie Gaudin. Houston J. Sachs, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Amélie Gaudin. And our final doctorate candidate, Caitlin Antoinette Bridges, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Amélie Gaudin.
Let me again offer my sincere congratulations to all our degree recipients. We're so proud of you.
Will the audience please remain in place during the recessional by the stage party, faculty, and degree recipients? Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. The 2025 Master of Fine Arts and Doctoral Commencement Convocation for Graduate Studies at the University of California, Davis is now closed. Will everyone please rise if able?